Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here, for coming to this conversation. My name is Alessandra Fogli. I'm from Italy, and I got my PhD from Penn, and I taught in several universities, including NYU and the U of M. And now I work full-time in the research department. I'm a senior economist in the research department of this Fed. And I'm very excited tonight to talk to you about my research, as well as some of very interesting initiatives that are going on right now in the Federal Reserve Bank. So after getting done with the disclaimer, the views expressed are my own and not the ones of the Federal Reserve System, let's get into the topic of this conversation. The topic of this conversation is inequality and mobility in US and in US cities. So one of the most dramatic economic phenomena of the last 40 years has been the increase in income inequality in US. So we live in the most unequal society today that has never been in US, and where the gap between rich and poor are at a historic high. So in my research, I ask the consequences of this rise in inequality on mobility, and in particular on the American dream. So has the dramatic increase in inequality eroded the idea that even if you start from a poor family or for disadvantaged economic condition, you can actually climb the ladder of economic success and then eventually rise to a higher rank in the income distribution. So has inequality eroded the American dream? So first I'm going to talk to you, walk you through some facts. So some historical experience of the US, how inequality has changed over time, how we measure inequality, how we measure mobility, and then I'm going to talk to you about segregation and the link between inequality, mobility, and segregation. So first we talk about inequality, and we measure inequality by looking at differences among rich and poor. And there are different ways to capture these differences and different outcomes that we can measure. We can measure incomes, we can measure wages as well as wealth, and we're going to look at the evolution over time of these three variables all over the US. And then we're going to talk about mobility. Mobility is really a different concept from inequality. Inequality is a static concept. It's just looking at the difference in one point in time between rich and poor. Mobility is a dynamic concept. The idea is what's the probability that if you're born in one part of the distribution, in one decile of the distribution, you can actually move to a different point later in life. So there is this dynamic concept, the idea that eventually individuals can change their rankings over time, and is measured by looking at the correlation between parents and children, parents' ranking and children rankings. So there can be difference between poor and rich, but there may be less or more mobility. So it doesn't mean that if there is more difference among rich and poor, you need to have a less mobile society. On the other hand, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is that inequality and mobility are linked, and not only they are linked with each other, but also they are linked with segregation, with residential segregation by income and education. The idea is that over time in US, inequality has increased, but at the same time, mobility has decreased. So the American dream has been eroded. I'll show you that. And this is linked to the polarization of society, where rich people tend to live closer to rich people, and poor people tend to live closer to poor people. And tonight I'm exploring the idea that inequality and segregation are feeding on each other. And the more inequality is bringing more residential segregation across the income classes. And in turn, this affects mobility and inequality of the future generation. So let's first look at the income inequality. And one of the, I'm going to show you some really famous pictures out of some very famous papers. This is Piketty and Sides, and they tracked the income share of the top 10% of the US population going back to the beginning of the century up to today with data that are comparable across time. That's not an easy job. And so what I did is to show how the top 10% of the income distribution, you know, initially in the beginning of the century, they own a large share, almost 50% of the overall income in US. This is, you know, their share has been going down during the 50s and the 60s, but recently, starting in the 80s, there has been a large increase in the share of income, of total income, going to the top 10%. So now, half of the entire income in the United States is actually held by the top 10%. Even more to that, suppose we break down this top 10% in the top 1%, the top 5%, and the top 5 to 10%. So the black line is the top 1%, and the blue line is the top 1 to 5%. So you can see that actually there is a large difference. But basically, this 50% is going 10% to the lowest group, and more than 20%, almost 25%, it's all going to the top 1% of the population. And this you can see that is historically, you know, high. This is coming, these earnings, these income differences are driven by differences in wages. And in particular, here I'm plotting another very commonly used measure of income inequality, that is the 90-50 ratio and the 50-10 ratio. So what do we mean by that? We simply take the wage of the top 10% of the population, 90 means top 10%, and we compare with the median, with the 50%. And we see how this ratio has changed over time. So 2 in 1973 means that the top 10% was making on average a wage that was twice as high as the median in the population. And this ratio has increased over time, meaning that the difference between the two wages have increased over time. The other line, the blue line, is showing the 50 to 10 wage gap. So it's showing instead the median wage compared to the wage of the poor, the bottom 10%. And this has been decreasing over time, saying that the denominator has been increasing over time, and so showing that if we look at the 90 to 10, for example, we can find differences that are in the order of 6 or 7 times higher wages for the top of the distribution compared to the bottom, and that this has been increasing over time. Now, of course, if the income and the wages of these different individuals in the income distribution have been increased so much, wealth is going to show, you know, large differences as well. So if we look at the top 1% of the wealth distribution, where we also incorporate not just the earnings from labor income and wages, but also we're looking at capital gains and other forms of wealth, then we see that the top 1% today is, you know, is owning something like between 40 and 50% of the total wealth in US. This is the top 1% of the population holding between 40 and 50% of the total wealth in US. So is the American dream fading? So as I say, the pictures I show you so far are pictures that are static. They say, okay, in one point in time, this group is making, you know, so much more than the other, and the rich, the top 1%, is holding, you know, a large share of the total wealth in the country. But what happens if we look at the American dream, that is at mobility, a measure that tells us what happens across these different rankings? Can you eventually, born in the top 10%, rise to the top 10% and eventually, you know, close those differences? Those differences could be there, but as long as they're reachable to everybody, maybe, you know, we should not be worried so much. But If instead, mobility is low, and if you are in the bottom 10%, you have no chance to reach the top 10%, then that would be a different, would actually imply a different picture of our society with different policy implication. So in this other picture, I'm going to show you the percentage of children earning more than their parents. This is what we call the absolute measure of mobility. So we're looking at kids and look at their rankings and look at their parents and looking at their rankings and trying to think about what's the percentage of children that eventually, fulfill the American dream and eventually make more than the previous generation. And this percentage of children making more than their parents back in 1940 was 90%. So the American dream was truly alive. 90% of the children, were going to make more than their parents. They were going to succeed and eventually, be better off than the previous generation. But as you can see from this graph, these percentages change dramatically over time. So it's not just that the richer are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer, but also that there is no crossing anymore. If your kid is born poor, he's not going to get richer over time than the previous generation. So the percentage of children that in 1940 was making more than their parents was 90% compared to 50%. I mean, it is more than halved. And it keeps going down. However, we cannot look at them yet. You see, it's not that I was lazy and I didn't update my slides, but we need these children to actually become adults in order to see, what's their income would like. So then people were asked. So this is just survey data. We're asked, every all citizen, there is a Gallup poll that is asking American citizens 18 and plus, what do you think about the American dream? Is the American dream still alive? And this is survey evidence, but it also shows that not that long ago, in 1985, the people that thought the American dream was dead was about 10%. And over time, 2015, the percentage of people that thought the American dream was dead tripled. So in about 40 years, there has been this generational change where 1/3 of the population now has changed their mind about the American dream and mobility and the possibility of the new generation to do better than the previous one. So this is also, I didn't put it here, but this is also different in terms of across, these responses are different across educational groups and across age groups and across race groups. So in particular, the uneducated, which means the no college graduate part of the population is actually the one that has been more pessimistic about the American dream. So the non-college graduate and the younger people and the and the minorities are those that are falling behind and don't believe anymore in larger part to the American dream. So how does the American dream looks like if you look at geography? So far we have looked over time. And we said over time, we see that the percentage of children doing better than their parents has been going down over time. This picture shows you metros by metros and county by county, what's the percentage of children that do better than their parents in a particular year. So we look in a particular year at 2000 and we see how we do in terms of percentage of children doing better than their parents in different geographic places in US. And there are huge differences. So this area that is darker in color is capturing the percentage of children, the lowest percentage of children that do better than their parents. So that's where the American dream is in serious trouble, because the number of children that are doing better than their parents is less than 4.8%. And you can see that there is a lot of clustering there. And there are particular areas that have, shown, less mobility. Instead, the light areas are those that fare better, where the mobility is higher and the share of children doing better than their parents is actually, in the very light yellow, larger than 16–17%. So there are, my research is about this map. It's trying to understand what is driving differences across cities and what is driving differences across time. So how we can explain, the change over time, as well as the different experiences in different areas of the country. So what's the link between inequality and mobility? There is a classic link, we call it, classic channel, why inequality may imply, less mobility, which is poor parents may simply have less resources to invest in their children. And this is there. But also, I'm exploring in my research a different link, which is not only poor parents may have fewer resources to invest, but also they may get less return, a lower return from their investment in children. And the key ingredient to explain that is segregation. So basically, the idea is that if you have more inequality is going to make rich richer and the poor more poor. And this may actually imply that rich people can afford housing that before the poor people cannot afford anymore. And so eventually lead to more residential segregation. If they have more residential segregation, what happens, and the key ingredient here is that if you are in a better neighborhood, you're probably going to have a better school and better services and better peers and better many things, so that whatever you do, whatever investment you make, send your kids to school or, choose a tutor or whatever investment you're making, you're probably going to get a higher return from that. And so that will imply even larger differences in educational outcomes in the following period, reducing mobility and feeding back in more inequality in the next generation. So the idea is to bring up the role of cities, the role of neighborhoods. Where you live, where you grow up matters for educational outcomes. So the idea is that this return from education, from going to school, may actually be higher exactly in richer neighborhoods. And this for a multitude of reasons, including public school funding. Public school funding are actually local and they are tied to where you live. And peer effects, having better peers around you, more educated, with lots of, extracurriculum activities, can actually help your own kid to do better. And learning from neighborhoods, knowing that there are stories of success, of people that can make it, it's actually important for children to invest and believe that they can do it, that they can be successful in life. So if that is true, if neighbor matters, and there is what we call in jargon an externality, then we have an amplification mechanism. There is a higher inequality brings, higher segregation because rich people know it's better to live in a rich neighborhood, so they're willing to pay more to actually live with each other. And by doing that, they lead to an increase in housing prices. And so, over time, the able but poor kid will have to actually, it becomes more and more likely to live far away in a different neighborhood where there are only poor kids. And so you have this switch from, a mix of income and able kids all living, in different neighborhoods, to having a society that is segregated, where rich people live with rich people, no matter what the ability of your kids are, and poor people live with poor people. And that implies that in next generation you see more segregation and eventually, lower mobility and more inequality. So basically, what happens is that poor parents, segregation is an amplification mechanism through which inequality generates even more inequality. So we can explain why it keeps increasing and lower future mobility. So let me show you why we think this channel, has some role in terms of explaining the facts. First of all, we find that there is a strong correlation between inequality and residential segregation, both across time and across space. There is across time, segregation and inequality have increased at the same time, and also the same cities where you find a larger increase in segregation, you also find a larger increase in inequality. Moreover, where segregation is higher, you find a larger educational gap between kids. So if a city is segregated, is highly segregated, and you look at the difference in educational outcomes between poor and rich kids, you find extremely large differences. If instead the city is not as segregated, those differences are lower. Also, in areas where segregation is higher, intergenerational mobility is lower. So let's first think about the first channel, inequality and segregation. So first thing I want to show you is that segregation and inequality move together. They move together over time. And then I'm going to show you they also move together across space. So the map that I was showing you before is sort of showing that the same cities where there is a lot of segregation, they also have a lot of inequality. But first of all, how to measure segregation? This is pretty much what we have in mind. There is a separation, a physical separation between neighborhoods such that, people are not evenly distributed. So what we use in this research is as a measure that is actually coming from sociology, and it's called the dissimilarity index. It is a measure of evenness. So it's trying to look at whether there is an even distribution of types across the census tracts in US. So in my work, I went back to when census tracts were first tracted, when we have data, which is 1970. And I look at every single census tract in US. And I look at the city where the census tracts are and compare the presence of poor in different census tracts. So for example, let's consider a city where you have only one person that is poor that is below some threshold of income. So overall in the city, there is 25% of the population is poor. But if the city is divided in 4 neighborhoods, how are these people divided across them? Where do they live? So what happens is that it could be that in each single neighborhood you have the same proportion as the city as a whole. So it could be that in each single neighborhood you have 1 person that is poor, 3 that are rich, or vice versa, exactly like in the city as a whole. Or it could be this other way, that is all the poor people or the right people are all concentrated in one area of the city, and all the blue people are in the other. So you see that here inequality has not changed. You always have 1 red person and 2 every 3 blue person. But what has changed is the distribution across census tracts. So my research is about thinking about this distribution across space, across census tract, and see whether it matters for future mobility and inequality. So this dissimilarity index is exactly calculated as a ratio, looking at each census tract and see what's the distance between the distribution in the census tract and the distribution at the city level, and summing up all these differences. And then you come up with an index that is the dissimilarity index for the city. Then what I do, I aggregate all cities, using population weights, and I plot my index, that is the red line, over time. And I plotted against a measure of inequality, that is the Gini coefficient. So what happens is that I show that, the two track each other. That pretty much, something that people don't know as much is that residential segregation by income and by education has been rising, a lot over time as well, starting in the 70s. In particular, with a big increase exactly in the 80s, that's when inequality started rising a lot. And when the return to college started increasing a lot, and people talk about whether that was initially due to skill bias technological change, to trade, to these different possible exogenous reasons why you might have been at first increase in inequality. But what I show and what I want to point here is that segregation has also increased over time in the same period. What about across space? Here I plot segregation in 1980 against inequality in 1980. So instead of looking over time, we look city by city in a specific year in 1980. And we see that some of the cities, the metros, where inequality is the highest, like New York, Los Angeles, and DC, are also those with a lot of segregation. And Minneapolis is right here, so sort of in the middle. What about segregation? Now we make the second step. So we see that inequality and segregation are linked to each other. They've been growing over time, and the cities where there is more inequality are also those with more segregation. And now we make the link between segregation and mobility. Are also the cities where you see more segregation, those with less mobility? So we find that in areas where segregation is higher, there is a large educational gap between poor and rich family and lower intergenerational mobility. The idea is that education should be, this elevator, this ladder to economic success, and maybe is not so much anymore. So here is a plot. Here I'm taking all the school districts in US. All the school districts in US and look at the test scores of their children. The test scores are on this axis. And then I plot how rich is the district, so the parents, wealth, on the x-axis. So the idea is, let's take a district that is very rich, like Edina. And let's see what are the test scores of the children living in Edina, and compare to the test scores of the children going to the Minneapolis schools or to Red Lake. And so the difference here are striking, because these are middle school age kids. And when I look at them in Edina, I see that they are already in middle school 3 grades ahead of the average. So the kid in middle school is already 3 years ahead of the average. The kid in Minneapolis public school is just, a little lower than the average, but those that live in poor districts are already 3 years behind the average. So in middle school, you have already differences in test scores that are an order of magnitude very hard to, if you think about it, to eventually reduce over time. Now, how is segregation playing a role? Well, segregation plays a role because it makes it worse. There is, on this axis now, on the y-axis, I look at the difference between the test scores, 6 years, 3 years, 2 years, between rich and poor. And on the x-axis, I look at my segregation index. So there is always a difference between the poor and the rich districts, fine, in terms of test scores. So this is always positive, the difference. But the difference is higher where segregation is the highest. So the more segregation, the more the difference is between the test scores of poor and rich districts. So that, you know, it's sort of like telling. And if we look, we also did this other way of measuring mobility. So the educational gap is already sort of a good approximation of what is going to happen, you know, eventually to the income of these kids. But we also looked at over time, you use the NLSY, which is a panel starting in the 70s, and we follow these kids over time, you know, born in different cities, and we know what their parents' income was. And we see what happens over 20, 30 years to their income. And we use this restricted data because they are geocoded, so we can actually know exactly, you know, where they were living, what they were making, and all this kind of information, and otherwise is confidential. And we look at what is called in the persistent Q1. That is, if you're born in the first quartile of the distribution, so in the bottom 25%, how likely are you to remain in the bottom 25%? So the persistence of poverty. How likely are you to stay poor if you're born poor? And what we see is that there is the difference increases when you have high segregation. So basically, if you are born in the bottom 25%, you have a 32% chance to stay there. So 1/3 of the probability you're going to stay there. If you look at metros where there is high segregation, this probability increases to, you know, over 40%. So there is almost a 10% difference in low versus high segregated metros. And it's similar also if you look at the very top. So if you are born, this is the Q4, means what instead if you're born in the top of the distribution, how likely are you to stay in the top of the distribution? And this probability is 46%, and it's even higher in high segregation cities. What we do is to put together these thoughts is to actually write a model that I'm not going to present today, but it's a mathematical model where you have individuals making choices of neighborhoods where to live, of educational choices for their kids, and eventually facing, you know, some budget constraint. And then eventually what we have is that there is the return to education is going to depend, the wage of the kids is going to depend on where, you know, they live, as well as their educational choice, ability, and all other, you know, characteristics. But the way we capture how much better it is to live in a, you know, nice neighborhood is actually important for the model estimates. And we look at Chetty and Andren, that are these famous economists in Stanford, that have run a very famous experiment called Moving to Opportunity Project. And so using this experiment, and I'm going to tell you more about it, it's basically giving vouchers to poor families in low-income part of the cities to move to a different part of the city or to a different city, and then see how better they do when the same person, you know, simply lives in a different environment. So we use his estimates for our model in order to spill out, you know, the importance of segregation over time and this feedback effect. So in this picture, I show you the estimates from the Moving to Opportunity project. So here we look at, as I was mentioning, you know, poor families that moved from, for example, Cincinnati and went to Pittsburgh. And suppose that Cincinnati is our benchmark, so we just, you know, normalize to 0. And Pittsburgh is the rich place, and we normalize to 100. And then we ask, how much better are, you know, these kids do when they move from Cincinnati to Pittsburgh? The problem with these kind of estimates is called selection. So you can just, you know, look at people that have moved, because there may be something about them that is different the simple reason they have moved must be that maybe they are more entrepreneurial, maybe they are more able, maybe they have, different preferences. So if you just look at people that move without any other sort of, we call controls, you may confuse, the two effects, the effects of being in Pittsburgh with the effect of being the type of person that moves. So what Chetty has done is to look at a lot of data where you have, for example, siblings belonging to the same family, but who moved at different ages. So if you move at age 9, 10, 11, up to 20. So what it's looking at is like kids that are born exactly in the same family, they are supposed to have the similar genetic makeup, they are supposed to have similar opportunities and so on, and simply moved to the better place at different points in life. So what we see is that if we look at kids that are 10 years old, their earning over time are going to be in between Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. So they're not going to look like the kids in Cincinnati. They're not going to Cincinnati. That's what the estimate says. And then over time, you cannot teach old dogs new tricks. There is not much more to gain. So unfortunately, after age 23, 24, no matter whether it's a hard truth, no matter where you move, you're going to look like Cincinnati. Okay, so why am I saying this? Because we use these estimates that are like super, the best estimates coming from the micro literature to actually say, okay, now that I move people around, what's going to happen to inequality, mobility in the next period? So what the model predicts is the effect for inequality and mobility. And I can also run what people call counterfactuals. That is, once I have a model where housing prices change because people are changing their, Chetty's estimates are done. People have moved from Cincinnati to Pittsburgh or vice versa, done. But actually, no, it's not done because the prices in those places will change, the housing prices. And then eventually, people will reallocate, they will relocate because housing prices have changed. And then eventually they will end up going in different schools in the next generation. And so this is going to actually have a dynamic effect over time. So the importance of using this estimate in what we call a general equilibrium model is to see where eventually we'll end up. And also trying to run experiments. What if there is no spillover or there is no neighborhood effect, but only the classical channel? How much is the classical channel going to matter for the link between inequality and mobility, and how much is the segregation channel going to matter? So what we do, we use the data that I show you about initial mobility, initial segregation, and initial inequality. And then we call the system. We change the return to college. The return to college in the 80s has spiked up. I showed you that. Maybe because of international trade, maybe because of skill-biased technological change. And then I look at the response of all the location choices, education choices, and how this feedback into next generation inequality, mobility. Then what I do is, run the counterfactual. So shut down the spillover effect, the fact that, the neighborhood effect, and see how much, what's the difference between my results. And then there is sort of like in physics, you run in a lab. You can actually shut down one variable and look at the other. And that's something that in economics we cannot do. We don't have a lab. So our models are our labs. We have the model, we can shut down, and we can see what happens without having to tell people, now you cannot move, To use Java, I don't care about Java right now. So what we find is about 1/4 of the increase in inequality and 1/3 of the increase in mobility. So what he wants for me, Okay. What we find is that this spillover effect is actually important. That 1/4 of the increase in inequality and segregation and about 1/3 of the decrease in mobility is due to the neighborhood effect. So these effects, can be quantitatively relevant. How to revive the American dream? So what do we learn from eventually, this channel? And this model, we say in economics, we have an externality, which means there is an effect, an external effect that on other people that individuals don't take into account when making their own choices. When that happens, that is, people are not taking into account, and when moving, I'm able, I'm smart, I go to the other neighborhood, I'm going to make everybody else smarter. I don't take that into account when making my residential choice. If that happens, the economic theory says there is a market failure. So there is a possible government intervention. Government can have a role, can actually, with taxes or subsidies, find an allocation that is Pareto improving the one that the market has achieved. So because of that, there is a role for policies in this model. And the idea is that, as I was saying before, education maybe is becoming a divider instead of an equalizer. So one thing that, we can think of, for example, is to break the link between residential choice and school choice, trying to provide, high education choices for everybody, making sure that there is access to good education choices for poor families as well. And so how to do that? There are different ways. For example, the school financing, that is localized here, and as well as housing policies. And there are already experiments that are run in different cities, in San Francisco, in Boston, where even if you live in one neighborhood, you are not entitled for sure to go to school in the same neighborhood. So there can be lotteries, there can be busing, there can be, of course, this will reflect in housing prices, and you need a model to say what are the final consequences. Somebody will lose, somebody will, gain, and eventually you want to assess, the final consequences. Another important topic that I have not touched yet, but is part of the big picture here, is race. So far in this research, tonight, in this conversation, we have abstracted from consideration that have to do with race. So we talked about poor and rich, and we talked about, college and non-college graduate, but we have not talked about the big differences there are between the outcomes of different races in US. Especially when we talk about segregation, we should be sensible to the fact that actually race is an important factor, and then we lived in the past in a highly segregated society. So let's look at what's the effect of race, for example, on wealth. And here I'm showing the average family wealth by race, so wealth and race. If we look over time, starting in the 60s to today, we see that the difference in the average family wealth between white, which is the blue line, and African American increased a lot, and now is like 7 times as large. So the average family wealth in a white family is about 7 times that of an African American family. And over here we look at Hispanic, and similar in differences, maybe not exactly as large, but 6 times is the factor that between the average wealth in an Hispanic family and the average wealth in a white family. So the same graph I showed you before about educational gap is also true when we break down the differences by race. So what I've been doing here is to look at white is the pink, and blue is the Hispanic, and green is the black population. So what you see here is that, well, the African American population is disproportionately living, in the more poor districts, and those are the ones that have, the lower test scores. For white, it's true too, but they're all shifted up. So even if, the one that is richer is having a better test scores than the one that is more poor, still, the difference is much larger, among the two races. So is that because of, white people go more to college? No, really. So if we control for education and race, we find that differences really do not go away. So here I'm plotting the median wealth by race and education. So the white are the light blue. The black population is the dark blue. And then there is the Hispanic, which is sort of grayish. So what happens is that the median wealth, is much higher for the college white than the college black. So it doesn't really matter. It's not enough to say, okay, if maybe the difference is that there is a different college graduation rates. Really not. Even when you look at college graduate, these differences are striking. And the unemployment rates are, twice or 3 times as large for college graduates that are black than the white. And so there are these differences that I think probably are also linked to the segregation, sort of mechanism. How does Minnesota compare? So I looked at, Minnesota compared to the rest of the nation in terms of inequality and in terms of disparities between races. And if we look at the share of the top 1% of income, we look at the black line is US and the red line is Minnesota. And what we see is that really, they track each other. So basically, Minnesota is not that different in terms of wealth inequality than the rest of the country as a whole. However, if we look at racial inequality, we find huge differences. So actually, Minnesota, I don't know if you knew that, I didn't know, but Minnesota ranks second in the whole country as a state with the worst racial disparities. So we have a small African American population, and where the median income for white is more than twice that for black, and unemployment rate that is almost 3 times as large, and an home ownership rate that is much higher for white than for black. So white people, 76% of them own their own house. And this is not a typical thing for the black family, where only 21.7% own their own house. And well, the incarceration rate per 100,000 people is simply striking, has very serious consequences for home ownership, for job finding rates, and and for children in the next generation. So very high, and I was surprised by that, and in particular our president, Neil Kashkari, was very struck by that. And so the last thing before I conclude and I take your question is I wanted to share with you this very exciting initiative that he started here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis last year, which is the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. So motivated by the general trend in US of rising inequality and fewer opportunities and less mobility, but also motivated especially by the racial disparities that are so close to us, that actually are prevalent in our own state, he started this institute. So he was able to found funding in Washington and finance this new initiative that is, whose mission is to conduct and promote research exactly about economic opportunity, trying to find policies that will actually make growth more inclusive. So it's not enough that we target inflation and unemployment rate on aggregate if there are so large differences between unemployment rate of a part of the population and the other part of the population. So it could be that we're doing great in terms of average unemployment rate, and we have like a 4 or 5% unemployment rate right now, one of the historical lowest. But on the other hand, we're also living in a society with large economic disparities, where this average unemployment rate is masking huge differences between different parts of the population, people with education, people without education, and minorities. So basically, thinking about that, the Fed is taking this role of not just thinking about the aggregates, but also taking charge and thinking about what could be a better way, what are the consequences anyway of our policies on distributional issues and not just on aggregates. So what, especially in view of our maximum employment mandate, because maximum employment is pretty clear. It means that we want full capacity. We want everybody that is able and willing to work to be able to. And that should be our goal, what the Congress is actually expecting us to do. And so taking that seriously, we started this institute with this mission, and we have, you can check the website, we have a fantastic board of advisors, all the people that I just show you pictures from Science to Cherry, they're all advisors on our board. And these are, some of the people that are helping us to think about what are interesting topics of research, which conference should we hold next time, what are the policy implications of different, papers or models that we've been thinking about. At the same time, not only we have this, fantastic board of advisors, but also a very rich visitor scholar program. So we actually every year, last year was the first year, so this is the second, we host something like between 15 and 20 visitors or scholars that come from different universities or other feds and across fields, even sociologists or lawyers or people that want to think about this issue in a broader way. And so we have a variety of research interests, a different stage of careers, more young people and more senior economists, as well as international and domestic visitors. So, and these people are coming to our own floor, on the 7th floor, on the research department. We are actually building new offices as we speak. And we're growing, a lot next year. Because it's important to have, interaction and to presentation like this one tonight, and trying to get feedbacks on what, the research of each of us is saying, what the findings are. And also we host a conference series. So we just had one last month about labor force participation, for example, and how labor force participation has been going down over time. So fewer Americans are actually looking for a job or want to work. And this is discouraging, because usually what happens is that people are not looking for a job if they think they cannot find one, or they think they cannot find a good one. And so sometimes unemployment rates being low does not really mean that the economy is doing well, but it may also mean that few people are looking, because the unemployment rate is the percentage that do not have job, but they are also looking. If you're not looking, you're not part of the unemployment rate. So we had this conference last month looking at the possible reason why labor force participation is going down, and also how different it is for different groups, educational groups, race, minority, as well as young and old folks and different demographics. And then instead, October, we're going to have 18th and 19th, a conference about inequality in cities. So we're going to think, so today we thought about within cities and how people may live in different neighborhoods within one city. And the conference in October is going to think across cities, how people move across cities and move from Minnesota to Silicon Valley or, or to New York, and what that implies, in terms of how some cities are booming and others instead are, dying, and how much divergence we observe across US. And how this is explained by similar, actually, effects of what we talked today. That is, some educated, skilled workers are more likely to go where other skilled and educated workers are, and so generating this feedback effect. And so we're going to have a really great lineup of experts that will be talking about more about inequality across cities in October. And then I hope that this translates into a conversation so that I can take your questions.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait until we bring you a microphone.
Hi, I'm Susan Geller, and I work in the northwest suburbs of Minneapolis, and we work with primarily the Wayzata and Orono school districts, and we find the data there shows that the children who are in the achievement gap are primarily low income or children of color, even though it's in one of the highest performing school districts.
Sure.
And we see that the our theory and around which we've built an initiative is that the critical component is relationship building, and that even neighborhoods, when you define them, look within, it's like still so much segregation. And how do we build connections across neighborhoods, even within wealthy communities? And I'm just curious if you've looked at that kind of data.
Sure. I haven't yet, and I think about an individual as, somebody in the middle of different circles. So of course, you're going to be affected by so many external factors. And here we're sort of looking more into them. But you have the family next to you. And then eventually you have the neighborhood. And then eventually you have the city. And then eventually you are in US. So the idea is that something that we have abstracted from is the family effect, for example, which I looked into in past research. But that's important. What your parents are doing, is actually very important, just in terms of not just their income, but role models or different working choices or different culture that is transmitted and values or whatever. So it's sort of like I think it's a first pass. This research to open up the box of what the external factors, society and peer pressure or neighborhood factor can imply for individual choice, but it's not complete. So I'm not saying that is enough to, take a kid that is poor, that has, some different family history around him, and bring him to Wayzata to make him exactly look like a Wayzata kid that is white and that is, coming from a different family. But I'm saying that that kid is probably going to have a better opportunity than the one that is not even in Wayzata, but is in North Minneapolis and has so many other issues to deal with just when he goes to school. So probably, this is just a start, but it would be great to being able to open up more, the box of how society in the large terms, affects individual economic choices. And we are at the beginning, because as economists, we usually abstract completely from a social factor. We just have optimizing rational individuals that, maximize their utility. Now we're finally understanding that, well, actually what happens around you matters for your choices. So I think it's a step but not, not the end of this run of research. But I would be very interested to see, data that speak to that. Yes.
Thank you so much for good information. My question is, are you planning to look at immigrants, new or been here for some period of time?
Great, that's a great question. I've been looking at immigrants in the past, and that's actually what I was referring to when I was answering the first question about like the effect of families and culture. Because in the past, I was looking, for example, labor force participation decision for women. And in order to see what, how values or culture or beliefs may affect your labor force participation choice, I looked exactly at immigrants. Because everybody that is an immigrant has the same opportunities. He actually was looking at second generation immigrants, so my own kids. Because those are, by any means, American citizens, were born in this country, raised in this country, went to school here, had the same opportunities and same constraints, and faced the same prices and institutions. But all the difference between them is that my kids have parents that come from Italy, and then there were other kids that had parents coming from a lot of other countries. And we look at their labor force participation choices, and we see that actually they reflect a lot, there is systematic difference in women that are born to parents coming from the south of Europe, for example, from women whose parents come from the north of Europe. Because in the south of Europe, they're used not to work as much, and having, maybe higher fertility rates and having a more traditional role for women. And then when you look at second generation immigrants here, you actually learn that those differences still matter even when everything else is constant. So even if when you control for where they live, what education have, their husband's income, and everything that you can observe, you can actually find that those values or that upbringing still matters today for the choice of my daughter to work or not to work, simply because their parents had a different system, social norms, different beliefs, and different family, values. And so that is also informative, and immigrants are a great, way to sort of, again, find what we call identification. That is having like a lab where you can have everything else constant, like prices, schools, and institution, and the only thing that changes is your the origin of your family. And this way, we can actually identify the effect of culture on from family on kids' decisions as adults.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. Amazing numbers. My attention was drawn to the wealth by education and race.
Sure.
That was really very dramatic differences between the race for the education, college-going, and college graduate for the minorities versus the whites. Yeah. It's like 10 times more. If you could please go back a little bit to
I'm going there.
The graph. I'm wondering what is driving that. This is huge. You look at the college educated for the minorities and the white. Are you doing any research in that?
Yeah.
What's driving
that? That's what we are all trying to understand. And I can tell you that, you can always control for more. There is a little bit of this sort of like a race in this profession. That is, you can always argue that there is an extra variable that can explain. Maybe the education is not exactly the same. Maybe they had not just college degree, but there is more PhD among. But maybe there is always that. So we control more and more and more. But I have to tell you that I haven't seen that difference disappear. I've seen it reducing. It can be reduced eventually if you keep controlling for things that may be endogenous themselves. That there may be investment decisions that are already part of a, a part of the problem. Because if you don't believe that you can succeed, then maybe you also invest less. So, but anyway, even after controlling for, all the observables, we call the things that we can measure, that difference can shrink but cannot disappear. So, and the same thing is with the gap between women and men. You can keep controlling for career, profession, occupation, and age, and so on, and that what we call residual, still stays there and does not disappear. So this is exactly what we're trying to understand, and discrimination can be, one of the explanation, and it's on the table. And we're trying to understand, for example, there is a really good work by Matsumder in Chicago Fed that was presenting here in one of the conferences held by the Institute on disparities, that is looking, for example, at redlining. So the maps that were actually drawn, like 40, 50 years ago, for where the white and the black will live, actually are still important to explain differences, in income across different groups. So that is one of the explanation on the table, and the Fed is interested in that because there is also a lot of literature about, for example, lending practices. And discrimination in lending practices can be one of the reasons why it may be harder for some minorities to afford a house and to buy a house, and so that may explain differences in home ownership rate. And kids that don't have a home have a harder time doing well in school, and so it's sort of like a vicious circle that, so trying to understand which is, the best policy is also linked to trying to understand better what are the most important mechanisms quantitatively, because we cannot go out and just try everything. We sort of want to have a good sense of what are the main mechanisms and how we can actually fix those, and be more effective in terms of policies.
I was a branch manager at a credit union in Fridley, so as a working class community, and we had it very multicultural, and I felt like the biggest difference I saw, particularly with young people entering the financial world and understanding it, is credit. So richer families teach their kids about building credit and not having debt, and that makes such a big difference on interest rates and getting approved for a home. And there is almost no education out there on credit in the school system.
That's a great idea.
And has the Federal Reserve looked at partnering with schools or education so that every student gets at least a basic knowledge of credit and how to affect their score and how it affects interest rates and how something at 18 years old can affect hundreds of thousands of dollars down the road?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it could be one of the ways, the Fed and the Institute can actually be effective. And we have a community development branch as well. So we have an academic, more research-oriented branch that is, looking at the data and, writing the model and trying to make this simulation and trying to think about policy implication eventually. But we also have a community development branch that is on the territory, that is, bringing the experience and the ideas of how we can eventually just doing that kind of service, that kind of policy that is information and education. And I think that could be, a great idea and maybe conversations like this can be useful too, in terms of creating information and understanding of some of the important facts that affect so much, like your future as a young person. So, yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you for your research. I'm curious here, I'm thinking about, if I'm hearing you correctly, this idea of the relationship between segregation and income inequality. I don't know which one's dependent, which one's the independent variable, but it speaks to the Matthew effect. But if you look at your research and it talks about how, it looks like in the late 30s, early 40s, income inequality declined. what reversed it? So you would think that it would continue to increase if there is a feedback loop. So what caused it to reverse course in the late 30s, early 40s?
Okay, so sure, actually that's a great question. So again, you know, like the idea that segregation may amplify doesn't mean that without segregation it should go the other way, because there are other mechanisms, including, you know, just simply the investment, the classical channel that I was talking about. So segregation, we see it as something that has been going on at the same time, and the two may be linked, but not the only driver. What was going on in that period was a big change, historical change, going from the Great Recession to the Second World War and the Reconstruction. So basically at that time, you know, the economy was booming, and we were going from a period of, you know, where the Great Recession hit to a period where there was a reconstruction and a lot of wealth, and people were, you know, working more and more in the labor force. So every period has a little bit, you know, their own sort of characteristic. And one thing that is going on now, it's not so much, you know, the Second World War, but it's actually, you know, the war is between college and no college. So what is going on now is the, you know, this polarization of society between those that are skilled and have found a job that gives them, you know, a lot of earnings and high wages, and those that don't and are left behind. So hopefully we don't need a war to improve that situation. So what we're trying to understand here is, given, you know, this last part of the century economic condition, what are, you know, the consequences among these variables? But that's a great question, sure. We cannot just explain with one variable, unfortunately, the whole period. That's what economists, is their weakness. They always find a reason.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your great presentation. My wife and I live in North Minneapolis, and we are kind of outliers in that way, and kind of made a decision once we got married to reverse the brain drain, as we called it. Right. And so we find ourselves to be misfits socially among our friends, and in fact we have a difficult time bringing up this conversation. Our friends feel guilty, they feel somewhat uncomfortable with our decision. It's an interesting thing. I'm looking at your chart around income inequality, this one.
Yeah.
And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I had always made the assumption that in around about 1980, which is when where fair housing laws were passed in 1968, and it takes a little while for people to start violating those racial boundaries. Yeah. And then between 1977 and on, it's about the same time that I heard all the ads on late night TV, no money down. You can scarf up some cheap properties that were being abandoned in cities where whites were flying away because blacks are invading, and moving and beginning to segregate now along class lines. Mm-hmm. Because in our community, for instance, we live on what the original owners of the house told us was called Baptist Hill. And Baptist Hill was the parish community for the Swedish Baptist Church just north of Broadway. And I assume that church, which was then based on denominational ties, and a lot of the parish communities were like that on the north side, and the Jewish community also, that those church communities, and we saw that in the remnants of those church communities, had a variety, a great wealth diversity within the congregations. Yeah. And what happened is, once fair housing laws were passed and blacks started to move in, all of the wealthier people left. And we, in fact, when we moved in 1996, there were still, and still are, a couple of the old Swedish population that were too poor to move. And so, so that integrated, economically integrated congregation became economically shattered. The wealthier moved out, the poorer stayed in, the parishes closed, you know, everything kind of fell apart, the social fabric fell apart, and then the empty houses and crashed the real estate market. No money down, you can live in Little Canada, buy a house in North Minneapolis, rent it out to people, get metro median rent for your housing subsidies, and so nobody's going to buy a house in Edina to rent it out to low-income people. You buy it where the housing prices are low, where the neighbors don't hold you accountable to keep the grass cut, etc. So, you know, I just wanted to throw that out and have your reaction on that.
Sure. No, thank you so much. You know, this is exactly the kind of you know, experiences that I'm interested in, because that's what my research is about, you know, is like how the divide among neighborhoods and the fact that there is polarization, and as you say, you know, like the diversity has been lost, and there is the social tenets, you know, has been, and the American dream has been, you know, fading. That has serious implications, and I think that, you know, race is a part of the conversation here. And for sure, you know, the paper that I was mentioning, the Mazumdar paper, is exactly, you know, looking at these kind of facts and how, you know, poor and African American, you know, may have been going together because of these maps that were, you know, sort of because of the history, because of the historical experience. And so how to revert that? I mean, the important thing is just bring it out there that neighborhoods are important, that, you know, segregation is, you know, an amplification mechanism, and you can actually, it can actually affect quantitatively, you know, in important ways, the outcomes and, you know, and mobility and the American dream, and bring it out there, and eventually, you know, trying to find the best solution to fix that. That's really the mission. It's not going to be easy, but I think that having a conversation tonight is already a good, you know, way to, yeah, to start something that is going to take a long time, a long journey. You know, it's not going to be overnight, but I think that these are all steps in the direction of, you know, and starting this journey together.
Well, I just say that being able to have a scientific premise for the conversation is a lot more refreshing than having to deal with it as a kind of personal experience.
Right, so that's our role, should be the one of trying to make sense, you know, in an economic way, so that we can actually think about policy, run experiments, and find support, you know, empirical support to some theory, and see how they hold in the data and what are the best ways to eventually confront them, attack them, and fix them. So that's the role of the research department, is really to, because we, you know, we may have different personal experience, but we all can sort of like trying to have a framework that helps thinking about all the different personal experiences.
We're going to take one last question before we adjourn.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I guess my question is just as volatile as his, so just be ready. So in looking at all this data, it seems to me that for minorities, when you kind of put it all together in your mind, I'm no economist, I'm actually a lawyer, unfortunately, so it means I'm not good at math. So I didn't put it all together in my mind. So it might just be like way off. But what do you think a solution be for some of these ills? Would it be a direct cash injection, such as reparations for African Americans, or et cetera? How would something like that begin to help solve some of these housing and socioeconomic divides that you have so brilliantly illustrated?
That's a $1 million question. As I said, the Moving to Opportunity project was, like a first attempt to actually give vouchers and have people move, away. But in the move, things are also lost. So it's always a little bit, like a two-sided kind of experience moving away from your place. So hopefully, in the next generation, we're going to think about, our schools and our communities and our society in a more comprehensive way. And these differences will not matter as much anymore. But just moving people around sometimes can be not the best choice. One thing that we have been considering, as the Fed is also to supervise, because the Fed supervises, other banks and lending practices, is that could be, an important way to make sure that at least at the very beginning, when when young people are looking for a mortgage or to buy the first house, they can actually have the same kind of experience that non-minority young people have. And on the other hand, you sort of want to make sure that they are also free to choose what they prefer, right? So and it's not clear if you want to move people around without them, choosing, making that choice, because other things get lost. Your network, the people around you, that your community. So it's an important question, and I think as a first step, probably thinking about lending practices, as well as thinking about school access to schools for all that are high quality. Will be, first steps in the right direction. And then there is I think there is a feedback mechanism, because when you have success stories in your neighborhood or in your community or in your, you actually see more people thinking that the investment has actually a good return, and so being willing to take that investment. So I think it's important to incentivize the first generation to change the pattern, then eventually you can see, dynamic effects, and eventually, changing generation by generation. But I don't think it's gonna be easy to do overnight.
Thank you, Alessandra.
It's a journey. Thank you.
We would greatly appreciate you filling out the